January 30th, 1945, Luzon, the Philippines. The sun hadn't yet risen over the rice paddies outside Cabanatuan, but the air was already thick with tension and the metallic smell of dried blood. The Imperial Japanese guards at the prison compound, men of the 14th Area Army, paced along the wire in silence. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't laugh. They just checked their rifles and waited. Because in their minds, this was sacred duty. No Allied POW was ever to leave Cabanatuan alive. Not after what happened in Bataan, not after MacArthur had fled. The orders were simple, scorched into every guard's memory: if the Americans come, kill every prisoner. Burn them alive if you must. Let none escape. The Japanese had fortified the outer fields with tripwires and bamboo stakes. Their patrol patterns rotated every 30 minutes. Each guard tower had a Type 96 light machine gun with overlapping arcs. No truck passed without inspection. And just beyond the outer fence, they'd strung thin cans on wires, empty ration tins, filled with pebbles. Anyone creeping through the grass would brush against the tripline, and the sound would ring across the compound. To the guards, it was an iron prison. To the prisoners inside, it was death on a schedule. They were not prepared for what was coming. It began with a strange vibration in the earth, so subtle it might have been wind or thunder in the distance. But it wasn't thunder. It was men. 121 U.S. Army Rangers moving in synchronized silence, crawling inch by inch through muddy paddies and knee-high brush, their faces painted black, their weapons wrapped in cloth. Each one carried grenades, Kabars, and M1 Garands wrapped in burlap. The vibration was their breath, their heartbeat, their resolve. Some of them had fought in New Guinea. Some had stormed beaches under fire, but none of them had ever faced a mission like this. Rescue 513 POWs in the middle of enemy territory, 6 miles behind Japanese lines, before the garrison could slaughter every one of them. And vanish before sunrise. Major Bob Prince, the assault team commander, checked his wristwatch. It was 19:07 hours. He lay flat on his belly, covered in rice stalks, eyes fixed on the Japanese tower guard who leaned lazily against his post, smoking. In the tall grass beside him, his radio man whispered, "They're ready on the north side." Prince nodded once. They'd coordinated it down to the second. Each team had rehearsed the charge until their feet bled, but all of that depended on one thing: a single distraction. On the far side of the camp, U.S. Army Air Force's pilot Captain Kenneth Schreiber banked a P-61 Black Widow low over the tree line. At exactly 19:15 hours, he kicked the rudder and began the feint. The aircraft swooped, pretending to malfunction. Its engines coughed and sputtered on purpose, stalling just enough to catch the eyes of every Japanese guard in the compound. They looked up, confused, distracted. And in that moment, Prince whispered 2 words into his radio. "Execute now." The darkness erupted. From the jungle line, Ranger bazookas barked once, twice, 3 times. The nearest guard towers exploded in fireballs of shattered wood and screaming steel. Garand rifles opened up across the paddies. Their staccato rhythm, sharp, surgical, terrifying, cut through the dark like lightning in a thunderhead. Crack, 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 8 rounds at a time. The Rangers moved like ghosts, firing in pairs, reloading with practiced fluidity. They swept through the perimeter fence before the guards even had time to respond. The Japanese machine guns that hadn't been hit returned fire in panic, but their arcs were tight and the Rangers were already inside them. Every step they'd trained for, every angle they'd rehearsed. One Japanese sergeant tried to raise his pistol and scream orders. A Garand round hit him center mass before the syllable even left his mouth. Inside the prison huts, the POWs jolted awake at the sound of explosions. Some screamed, others clutched each other. A skeletal voice rasped through the darkness. "They're here." Private Tommy Thomas, captured 3 years earlier on Bataan, thought he was hallucinating. But then he saw them, men in American uniforms, carrying the familiar shape of Garand rifles, shouting in English. "Get up, we're the Rangers, we're getting you out." The prisoners didn't move at first. Many of them couldn't. They were too weak. Some hadn't walked in months. Others had festering wounds or fever. But the Rangers were ready for that too. They dragged men onto stretchers, lifted them onto their backs, passed them hand to hand through burning huts. Some POWs tried to crawl. Others simply wept. One whispered, "I thought we were already dead." Corporal Norm Jessen, a ranger carrying a 90-pound POW on his shoulders, replied through gritted teeth, "Not tonight." A Japanese officer blew a whistle. From the barracks on the northern edge of the compound, a fresh wave of guards came charging with bayonets fixed. But the Rangers had flanked the approach. When the guards rounded the corner, they ran straight into a crossfire of Garands. 8 rounds, clip ping, reload, 8 more. By 1930, the camp was burning. Screams echoed through the trees. The Japanese were in disarray. The Rangers moved fast, herding the freed prisoners toward the extraction point. But then came the one thing they couldn't train for. A Japanese reaction force, over 200 men, was rushing down the road from Cabanatuan city itself. They had machine guns, mortars, and motorbikes. And the Rangers were still dragging half-dead men through wet fields. Prince's radio crackled, "Enemy inbound, less than 5 minutes out." They were about to be overrun. And then, from the far side of the tree line, came a roar no Japanese soldier expected to hear again. Tires spinning in the mud, engines revving, dozens of Filipino guerrillas under Captain Pajota, hidden since sunset, sprang their ambush. They opened fire with Garands, Springfields, bars, and even a few stolen Nambu machine guns. The road became a furnace. The Japanese column slammed into the kill zone and never got back up. Back at the camp, Major Prince gave the signal, "Full withdrawal now." One by one, the Rangers lifted the last POWs onto Carabao carts, jeeps, and their own shoulders. A few of them had taken hits. One had lost an eye. Another was shot through the thigh and refused evacuation until every prisoner was out. At 2,000 hours, they melted back into the jungle. Smoke trailed behind them, rising from the compound like a funeral pyre. They had come 30 miles behind enemy lines. They had killed 523 enemy troops. And they had rescued every single one of the 513 POWs. The Japanese swore no prisoner would ever escape. The Rangers answered that oath with fire. The jungle swallowed the sound of retreat, but not the weight of it. Mud sucked at their boots. The bamboo cracked under hurried steps. The cries of the sick and wounded echoed in the trees, low and hoarse, but no one slowed. The Rangers moved in formation, rifles gripped tight, eyes scanning the brush with every breath. They'd trained for weeks, planned for days, fought for minutes. Now they were running a marathon in the dark, carrying men who had barely walked since '42. Behind them, the fire still lit the sky orange. Cabanatuan prison was burning, but not fast enough. The Rangers had expected to be long gone by now, but everything had slowed once the POWs began collapsing. Some of them had crawled out of huts barefoot. Others screamed in delirium at shadows. Many couldn't understand what was happening. Freedom wasn't something they believed in anymore. Not after 3 years of hell. Sergeant Hank Tufts dropped to one knee and adjusted the improvised sling holding a prisoner across his back. The man weighed almost nothing, skin on bone. Tufts could feel ribs pressing into his spine, each one a silent scream of starvation. "Hang on, brother," he said, rising again with a grunt. "You're not dying out here, not after that." Up ahead, Major Prince halted briefly at a junction in the trail. His eyes swept north, then west. The moon peeked through the canopy, casting a pale glow over the jungle path. Pajota's guerrillas had stalled the Japanese for now, but command had warned of reinforcements moving from Plaridel and Yin, columns with mortars, trucks with floodlights, machine guns. Prince didn't say a word. He just lifted his hand and pointed west. They moved. At the rear, Captain Juan Pajota's Filipinos faded into the brush like smoke. Their ambush had been brutal. The Japanese road column never had a chance, and Pajota knew it would only buy minutes, maybe 20. Not enough to fight a battle, but enough to escape a massacre. He jogged back toward the trail, past the bodies still smoking on the roadside. 2 of his men were crouched over a captured Nambu, checking for usable ammo. One looked up. "We hold here again, Captain." Pajota shook his head. "No, we've done our part, now we melt." He turned toward the trees and disappeared without another word. Miles behind them, the Japanese regimental headquarters in Cabanatuan was a hurricane of shouting. Lieutenant Colonel Matu Nakajima stared at the map. He didn't need a map. He could smell the burning camp from his command post window. "What do you mean they took them all?" The runner trembled. "Sir, the entire prisoner camp is empty. Every single man gone. The Rangers, they—" Nakajima's voice turned to a low growl. "You let 500 enemies disappear under your nose." The officer beside him fumbled with a radio handset, trying to raise pursuit teams. Nothing but static. The ambush on the road had severed their forward frequencies. Nakajima stepped forward, his face pale with rage. No prisoners were to escape. No one, that was the order. He turned to his adjutant. "Send every company within 10 miles, every unit. I want heads." The man saluted and ran. Nakajima stood alone, his hands shook. The Rangers pushed through thickets and ravines, inching toward the Pampanga River. The carts creaked under the weight of the wounded. The stronger prisoners took turns carrying the weaker ones. 2 Marines, captured at Corregidor, insisted on walking without help even as they staggered with every step. "I didn't come this far to die like a dog in the bush," one muttered. "I'll crawl if I have to." Lieutenant John Murphy checked his map under a red lens flashlight. The river crossing was less than a kilometer away. But the terrain had turned cruel, narrow trails cut with gullies and roots like tripwires. Every delay carved seconds off their survival. Behind them, distant echoes rolled through the jungle. Not firecrackers. Gunfire. They reached the crossing by midnight. The river was dark and sluggish, knee-deep in some places, chest-deep in others. The bamboo raft teams, local Filipinos who had risked their lives for the mission, were already waiting in silence. No one spoke. The Rangers formed perimeter rings, Garans braced in the crooks of arms, their breath steaming in the humid air. One of them, Private Leland, hadn't said a word since the raid began. He'd taken a bayonet through the calf but still carried a prisoner half his size across the field. He leaned against a tree, eyes locked on the tree line behind them. Every twig snap became a rifle bolt in his head. Prince walked over and knelt beside him. "You good, Leland?" The private just nodded. "Reloaded." Another nod. Prince gave him a pat on the shoulder and moved on. The prisoners crossed first, one at a time. Some crawled, some were carried, some wept when they touched the far bank as if afraid it might dissolve beneath them. Then came the Rangers. Last across was Sergeant Tufts, still carrying the same man from the camp. When they reached the far bank, the Filipino guides motioned silently. "Move fast, patrols will come now." Prince turned to look back one last time. The river was already calming as if it had never been crossed. The jungle, still and vast, swallowed every footstep. They marched again. By sunrise, they reached the village of Balingcarin. Trucks awaited, salvaged GMCs and old jeeps flown in days before, driven by Filipino guerrillas and U.S. Alamo scouts. They loaded the prisoners gently, helping them into the beds of the trucks with blankets and canteens. One old man, a former lieutenant colonel, clutched a ranger's sleeve with skeletal fingers. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I thought America forgot us." The ranger stared at him and shook his head. "We never forget our own." Back in Cabanatuan, the Japanese scoured the surrounding countryside in rage. Nakajima's orders were brutal. Villages were torched. Civilians were executed. Anyone suspected of aiding the Rangers was tortured. But they found nothing. Not a footprint, not a body. The raid had left no trail. The guards who had sworn no man would escape were left with empty towers, smoldering wreckage, and a memory that would haunt them for the rest of the war. On February 3, 1945, the rescued prisoners arrived in American lines at Gimba. Journalists and medics swarmed the convoy. The photos that followed, gaunt men with sunken eyes being lifted from trucks, saluting with trembling hands, were broadcast across the world. In San Francisco, a nurse broke down sobbing when she saw her brother's face in a photo. He had been listed as dead for 2 years. In Washington, General MacArthur placed the photos on his desk in silence and whispered to no one, that is how we keep promises." For the Rangers, there was no celebration. They resupplied, cleaned their rifles, and prepared for the next operation. Some of them carried new scars. Some would never speak of what they saw inside the huts. Others would live with the memory of carrying men who had forgotten how to speak. But all of them knew one thing. They had made history. And more than that, they had erased shame. Bataan had fallen. But Cabanatuan had been reclaimed, not in symbols but in lives. Lieutenant Colonel Matu Nakajima stood alone in the center of the ruined Cabanatuan compound. Morning light slashed through the smoke. The guard towers were black stumps. Charred beams jutted from the main hut like broken fingers. The stench of burning canvas and flesh still hung over everything. He didn't speak. 2 guards knelt in the dirt nearby, faces pressed to the ground, waiting for the order they knew was coming. But Nakajima said nothing. There was no order. There was nothing left to command. He had failed. The oath to the emperor had been simple. No Allied prisoner will ever be returned to his army. That order had echoed from Tokyo down through every level of command. No man under Japanese custody was to be freed. If capture brought shame, rescue was disgrace. And now, 513 ghosts had vanished into the jungle. Nakajima slowly turned and walked out, each footstep crushing ashes into the soil. Behind him, one of the kneeling guards began to sob. 3 days later, 250 miles away, at a temporary hospital in Leyte, Private Tommy Thomas sat under a mosquito net and stared at a bowl of hot stew he hadn't touched. The skin around his wrists still bore the purple grooves of wire binding. His uniform hung loose on a borrowed frame of bone and willpower. "You okay?" the nurse asked him gently. He blinked, then finally spoke. "They said it was Rangers," he whispered. "Real Rangers." The nurse nodded, smiling. "Every single one of 'em." Thomas looked down at his trembling hands. "I thought they were ghosts," he muttered. "I thought I died. That was the only thing that made sense. I thought maybe I died and they came for me anyway." On February 8th, General Tomoyuki Yamashita received the full report. The commanding general of Japanese forces in the Philippines, the Tiger of Malaya, had read every line twice, first in disbelief, then in silence. The American Rangers had penetrated 30 miles behind the front line, through open terrain and patrol zones. They had coordinated with guerrillas, disabled multiple response teams, and exfiltrated without a single prisoner left behind. Over 500 Japanese troops were killed in the process. Ranger casualties, 2 dead. Yamashita set the report aside. Begin immediate review of all remaining prisoner installations, he told his chief of staff. No garrison will be left under 500 men. Kill orders are to be issued in advance, not awaiting activation. The aide hesitated. Sir, our divisions are already stretched. We cannot. Then stretch thinner, Yamashita said. His tone wasn't angry. It was resigned. If the enemy believes every man will come home, they will fight without limits. He turned to the window, gazing at the haze over the jungle ridges. They came for their ghosts, he said, and found us instead. Back in Luzon, the rangers who had stormed Cabanatuan were already moving again. There were no parades, no flags, just more mud, more orders, more night patrols. Sergeant Hank Tufts cleaned his gear end in silence, the metal still blackened from the compound fire. The rifle was nicked along the receiver. He hadn't noticed until now. The scrape had likely come when he dove over the barbed wire, dragging that one prisoner who couldn't walk. He turned the weapon over in his lap, feeling the weight of it. Then he looked across the clearing. Private Leland was sharpening his kabar with a whetstone, his eyes as distant as they'd been since the mission. Tufts nodded to him. You get that scar stitched up yet? Leland didn't look up. Did it myself. Tufts grinned faintly. Of course you did. They said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. They had seen too much. In San Francisco, a telegraph operator dropped a message onto a pile of others just like it. To Mrs. Maria Rodriguez, Fresno, CA. From U.S. Army Information Office. Subject, Son Private Luis Rodriguez. Message alive, safe, returning. Messages like it had gone out all week, hundreds of them. Mothers screamed. Wives fainted. Whole neighborhoods wept in the streets. A barber in Des Moines offered free shaves to every returned POW. A diner in Portland renamed its breakfast special, the Cabanatuan Stack, and served it with 8 eggs, a joke no one explained. The country inhaled. For 3 years those men had been ghosts, and now they were alive. But for some of the Rangers, the return brought only restlessness. Major Bob Prince stood under the eaves of an officer's barracks on Leyte, rain soaking his boots. A correspondent had just left, notebook full of questions he didn't answer. He lit a cigarette and looked out toward the coast. What happens next? Someone asked behind him. He turned. Captain Pajota leaned against the wall, his uniform patched, his face lined with exhaustion and something older, the wear of guerrilla war. Prince exhaled slowly. They'll say it was a miracle. It was. I know. Pajota looked down at the mud. You know what your raid did? Prince glanced at him. It told the Japanese, Pajota said, that they can't make us vanish. They can shoot, burn, bury, but we'll come back. Prince nodded. Yeah. He flicked his cigarette into the puddle. Yeah, we will. Deep in the mountains north of Manila, a different kind of conversation took place. A staff officer knelt before his superior in a bamboo field command shack. His face was pale. His hands trembled. The American prisoners, he said, they were taken by ghosts, by demons. The colonel stared at him. No, he said quietly, not ghosts. He walked to the center of the shack, past a folding map table, past a radio crackling with broken static. They were Rangers. He said the word like it was a spell. The staff officer swallowed. We should increase patrols near. No, the colonel said. It's too late. We have shown them what fear does. We have shown them starvation, filth, beatings, and they came back anyway. He stepped to the edge of the shack and looked out into the jungle. They are not here to rescue. They are here to make us understand. Back at the front, Tufts found himself standing guard one night with Leland again. The jungle stretched black around them, buzzing with insects, humming with heat. Tufts leaned on his rifle. You ever think about what we actually did? He asked. Leland didn't answer at first. "I think about the guy I carried," he finally said. "Didn't weigh more than a rifle crate." He paused. He thanked me, and then cried because he didn't remember how to walk. Tufts said nothing. They stood in silence a long time. Eventually, Tufts looked out toward the darkness and muttered, "Worth it." Leland just nodded once. Far beyond Luzon the stories spread, not just in America, across Europe, across the Pacific. Even inside occupied territories, word of the Cabanatuan raid reached Allied prisoners, whispered in the dark, passed between cells, carried like a spark through barbed wire. They were coming. They would come. And in Tokyo, months before the atomic bombs would fall, the name Cabanatuan was read aloud to the high command. An officer from the War Ministry cleared his throat and said simply, "There are Americans who will cross a jungle to save men, already marked for death." Silence followed. No one replied. The jungle rains came heavier in March. Sheets of warm water fell across Luzon, flattening trails, flooding ravines, turning every rice paddy into a swamp. But it did not slow the war. Rangers patrolled through the muck with ponchos clinging to their frames and mud swallowing their boots. Filipino guerrillas marked trails with slashed banana leaves and chalk symbols pressed against bark. And across the shattered footholds of Imperial Command, the name Cabanatuan no longer passed in full voices. It was muttered, avoided, chewed like a bad tooth. Because for the first time in the war, the Japanese army had to accept that they had been outplayed not by tanks or ships, not by planes or generals, but by a group of men in boots, crawling through grass with knives and rifles, who had walked into the heart of their prison complex, and walked out again with everything. The rules had changed. In the mountains north of the Pampanga River, Lieutenant Colonel Nakajima had been reassigned to a penal unit tasked with reinforcing forward outposts. His uniform still bore the faded patches from Cabanatuan, but no one spoke of it when he entered a room. No one saluted too sharply. No one made eye contact too long. At night he stared into the fire and thought of the wires that had once surrounded the compound. The tripwires, the kin traps, the patterns of the guards, all accounted for, all useless. He remembered the brief vibration he'd felt just before the attack, the moment he had mistaken the tremble in the ground for distant thunder. But it wasn't thunder, it was Americans. And that haunted him. South of Manila, prisoners in other camps began to whisper. It began with a letter smuggled into a bamboo cell in Los Baños. Then came the drawings, crude sketches on scraps of rice paper. One showed rangers carrying prisoners across a river. Another showed a blazing hut and a silhouetted figure with a garand. It didn't matter if the details were accurate. The idea spread like wind through dry grass. Cabanatuan was proof. Rescue was possible. The Japanese tried to stamp it out. Extra guards were posted. Executions increased. Punishments were delivered for even a rumor. But every lash of a whip only confirmed the truth for the prisoners. If they were punished for believing it, it must be real. Among the rangers, the name of the mission was never spoken with drama. They didn't say Cabanatuan like it was a movie title. They said it like it was a wound. Leland developed a tremor in his left hand. Not enough to stop firing, just enough that he stopped shaking hands. Tufts walked with a limp he swore was from a training injury, though his leg had been bruised black from diving through a crater during the withdrawal. They didn't talk about the men they carried, but sometimes, in the stillness between patrols, they would glance at each other across the fire and know the weight hadn't left either of them. At night, Tufts could still hear the ping of garand clips ejecting in the darkness, echoes wrapped in smoke. He didn't know if it was memory or imagination. And he didn't care. In Washington, the photographs arrived. War Department officials gathered around the black and white prints, the skeletal survivors, the faces of men thought long dead, the burn marks on their backs, the eyes sunken but alive. A general held up one photo to a colonel. "This," he said quietly, "is worth more than 3 divisions." The message had gone global. America would reach its own. Behind the closed doors of the Office of Strategic Services, Cabanatuan became a case study, a model for integrated rescue, coordination with locals, synchronized diversion, use of elite light infantry. But outside the briefings, it became something more, a symbol. Weeks after the raid, a journalist tracked down one of the Rangers on rest in a tent near Lingian Gulf. He asked what it felt like to be part of the greatest POW rescue in military history. The Ranger, a corporal named Harris, shrugged. "We did what needed doing," he said, still cleaning the bolt on his rifle. "They'd done it for us." Not far from Manila, Major Bob Prince met again with Captain Pajota. They stood at the base of a mangled telegraph pole, watching smoke rise from the lowlands. Pajota chewed betel nut and spat. "You think it changed anything?" Prince nodded slowly. "Yeah. Morale. Doctrine." Pajota glanced over. "You mean theirs?" Prince looked toward the horizon. "And ours." Somewhere in a jungle clearing, a Japanese soldier watched his commander burn the last of the camp files. He wasn't told why. He didn't ask. He just stared at the fire as the pages curled and turned to black ash. But he heard the officers muttering, about Rangers, about Cabanatuan, about how no camp would ever be left so vulnerable again. That night when he took his watch on the outer perimeter, he double-checked his rifle, not out of duty, out of fear. He didn't fear a battalion. He didn't fear artillery. He feared a man in the grass with black paint on his face and a garand wrapped in burlap. In early April, the 6th Ranger Battalion was rotated back for rest. The men were thin, filthy, quiet. Some had mail, others didn't. Some drank, others stared at the ocean for hours. But none of them talked about what they'd done like it was legend. Tuff spent 2 days carving a small cross from driftwood and tied it to a tent pole. No one asked who it was for. Leland borrowed a typewriter and wrote letters to every family of the men they'd rescued who didn't make it out. He never mailed them. He burned them in a coffee can behind the mess tent. The war would go on. It would roll over Okinawa and Iwo Jima. It would end with fire over Hiroshima. But the raid at Cabanatuan remained fixed, not because of how it changed strategy, but because of what it said about the will to fight. Not for territory, not for glory, but for each other. By the end of May, the heat over Luzon came heavy and slow, like a wet blanket stretched across the island. The rains had backed off for weeks, and the jungle began to stink of rot again, of old sweat, dead leaves, and spent gunpowder. American lines had moved north. The 6th Ranger Battalion was now deep in the Cordillera Range, operating in smaller detachments, linking up with Filipino scouts and recon teams. The radios worked less often. Messages were sent by runners again. And out in the brush, no one knew exactly where the front was anymore. Sometimes, it wasn't even clear which direction it was moving. But one thing had stopped moving entirely: prisoner transfers. Since Cabanatuan, every report of a POW camp came with the same footnote: all prisoners executed on site before arrival. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't tactical. It was fear. The Japanese were no longer protecting prisoners. They were destroying evidence. Because Cabanatuan had taught them a lesson they couldn't unlearn. America will come. And they will come like smoke and lightning. Tuft sat on a ridge above a ravine, his boots off, steam rising from soaked socks. His rifle lay across his lap. The Garand was still scratched from the prison raid. He hadn't bothered to clean the stock. It had earned the scars. Below, a Filipino scout was gutting a boar they'd trapped. Nothing wasted. Not anymore. Rations were low, and supply drops couldn't keep up with the terrain. Leland returned from a forward crawl with mud in his teeth and a spider bite on his neck. 6 Japs dug in, nest above the bend in the stream. Tufts nodded. "We go around." "Nope." Tufts stood, stretched his back. "We walk right through." "We fly." An hour later, they slid through the ravine as the sun fell low, crossing under the sound of wind and rifle metal. Leland took point. Tufts watched the slope above. They hit the nest at dusk. 3 Garans cracked in perfect rhythm, cutting down the first machine gunner before his finger hit the trigger. The rest tried to scatter, but the Rangers didn't miss. They'd trained for this. 8 rounds, ping, reload, 8 more. The firefight lasted less than a minute. When it ended, Leland found a set of dog tags on one of the Japanese soldiers. Not American ones, just an American dog tag looped through the enemy's belt. It had belonged to a POW. He turned it over in his hand, then handed it to Tufts without a word. Back in the Japanese rear positions, morale collapsed faster than formations. Officers who had once lectured on the divine destiny of the Emperor now spoke of inevitability in whispers. The Rangers weren't a rumor anymore. They were a reality. Camps were dismantled. Prisoners were moved further north, then murdered before the enemy could reach them, not as an act of cruelty, as a form of control. If America couldn't find its men, it couldn't rescue them. But every time another Japanese unit was overrun, every time a Garand echo rolled across a hillside, that control cracked. In a clearing near Bontoc, a Filipino farmer stumbled upon the body of a Japanese captain hanging from a tree, an empty scabbard at his waist. Beside him was a sign, written in crude English. "We failed, they came." No one claimed credit. But the message spread. By July, the 6th Ranger Battalion was down to a skeleton crew. Some had rotated out. Others were lost. One was shot by a sniper walking to take a piss. Another collapsed from dysentery before anyone knew he was sick. Tufts was thin now, gaunt. His hands shook when he sat still, but he didn't sit often. He kept patrolling, kept checking gear, kept walking. Leland followed, always silent, always a step behind. They didn't speak much anymore, but they moved like men who didn't need to. The rhythm of the Garand had wired itself into their bones. Back in the States, the War Department published a booklet titled The Raid at Cabanatuan. It was circulated among new recruits, read aloud in churches, printed in newspapers. The message was always the same. We do not leave our men behind. For those still fighting, that message meant something more. No matter how far they fall, someone will come. In August, a radio operator picked up a faint signal from a high ridge in Ifugao. 3 short bursts, then 3 more, then 3 more. SOS. No one knew who sent it. No patrols had been in that area for weeks. No prisoner camps were officially logged in that zone. But the Rangers moved anyway, fast, quiet, light, just like before. They reached the ridge at dusk and found a single man in a Japanese uniform, holding a hand mirror and bleeding from his chest. He was American, a Marine, captured in 1942. They carried him out. He died 2 days later, but not before whispering one word. Home. At the end of that month, Tufts stood on a supply dock on Mindoro, watching a boat load up crates for return transport. It was filled with wounded, with bandages, with hollow eyes and quiet prayers. He reached into his pack and pulled out the dog tag Leland had given him. Then he tossed it into the bay. The war would end weeks later, with fire from the sky, with the Emperor speaking in a voice no subject had ever heard. But for those who had stormed Cabanatuan, the war had ended the night they heard that first tower explode. When the wire went down, when the Garans opened fire in the dark and made history echo. They hadn't saved the world. They hadn't ended the war. They hadn't changed fate. But they had kept a promise. And sometimes in a war like this, that was enough. The sun rose slowly over Luzon on September 2nd, 1945. The mountains held onto the mist a little longer that morning, as if the island itself wasn't ready to accept what had happened. The war was over. Tokyo had surrendered. The emperor's voice had been heard. The Allies were victorious. But out in the hills and valleys where the Rangers had fought, bled, and disappeared into the trees, there were no headlines. There were only men, some limping, some silent, all changed. Tufts sat on a dry log in a clearing north of San Jose, scribbling into a weather-stained notebook. His handwriting was slow and uneven. He hadn't written anything personal in months, but now the words came, raw and halting. We went in for men who were already half dead. We came out with ghosts made flesh. The jungle remembers, so do we. He closed the book, said nothing, just stared out over the trail that had once led them into hell. A week later, the 6th Ranger Battalion was pulled back toward Manila. Official orders, redeployment to Leyte, then by ship to Okinawa for final garrison assignments. But most of them never made it past the airfield. Doctors intervened, psychologists debriefed teams. Some Rangers had lost too much weight, others had too many tremors, others didn't speak unless spoken to. They'd become shadows of a mission that had been too successful to understand. The brass wanted photos, interviews, medals. But the men only wanted rest. Tufts turned down 2 newspaper interviews. Leland refused to answer any letters at all. Others gave fake names at discharge. Their silence wasn't secrecy. It was memory. The men they rescued had gone home in stages. Many were too weak to stand without help. Some couldn't eat solid food for months. Others had forgotten how to write, or even how to speak English fluently after years of Tagalog, Japanese, or nothing at all. But each one boarded a transport, each one returned. One of them, a chaplain named Ernest Miller, stood in front of a small-town congregation 6 months later and spoke only one sentence before breaking down. They came for us. It was all he could say. It was all anyone needed to hear. In Japan, the Imperial Army buried its shame in silence. The orders for future POW handling were never mentioned again. The Cabanatuan guards who survived the war were rounded up, interrogated, and later stood trial. Most of them claimed ignorance, claimed surprise, claimed they didn't believe Americans would come for prisoners that far behind the lines. One translator asked a former sergeant why he hadn't evacuated the prisoners when the Americans landed on Luzon. The man paused, then said simply, "We thought no one would come for them." He blinked once. We were wrong. Back in the Philippines, an old farmer visited the ruins of the camp in 1946. The jungle had started taking it back, vines curling through the fence posts, the bamboo huts already collapsed under monsoon weight. He stepped through what had once been the main compound and looked down at the charred imprint of a tower's base. From his satchel, he removed a tin marker and pressed it into the soil. It read only, January 30, 1945. Rangers came through here. On the other side of the world, in a steel-gray hallway in Washington, a young Army lieutenant passed a wall lined with plaques. He stopped in front of one, newly bolted into the marble. It listed no names, no units. Only a title, Cabanatuan Raid. And beneath it, carved into the surface, Leave no man behind.